Please welcome our speaker today, Ferenc Huoranszki, or Huo. He's from the Central European University, and he focuses on metaphysics and the philosophy of action, particularly free will, causality, and modality. And he also works on 18th century philosophy. Today we're going to talk about his paper on teleology in the philosophy of action. Now, as last week, I'm going to do a short introduction of the paper just to give some signposts, and then we will open up for discussion. So the central question is what distinguishes the deeds and doings of someone from those events which merely happen to her. And there are basically two approaches to this issue. One is based on efficient causes, that there is some efficient cause that precedes the behavior in question, and which, in virtue of which the behavior is intentional. And alternatively, one can appeal to Aristotelian final causes, and the goal of the paper is to motivate this second approach. We have 5 large sections. The first concerns Aristotle's own notion of teleology, and then we have arguments against 3 efficient causation-based accounts. And finally, we will look at the idea that intentional action is somehow related to trying, and that view will lead naturally into a teleological account of action. So final causation in Aristotle, there are 3 aspects of Aristotle that of Aristotle's notion of teleology that must be emphasized here. The first is that it's not meant to be a form of backward causation. So it's not that the goal somehow exerts a backward influence in time to guide the behavior or something like that, because the end need not be realized in order in order for someone's behavior to be intentional. So I can intend to do various things without actually achieving those ends. The second is that it's meant to be an immanent form of teleology. The property of occurring for the sake of something is meant to be intrinsic to the processes or events in question. We're not engaging in natural theology. And the third is that it's not a mentalistic concept. This is not Huo's own term. What this means is that the goals or ends for the sake of which an agent behaves in the way she does need not be antecedently represented by the agent. Now, I take it that the general character of this view is the following: someone fies intentionally if and only if she fies for the sake of something. Now, this is, in the present context, this is not meant to have any moral implications. So it's the end need not be the good of the agent or anything like that. And it doesn't even need to have any prudential implications. So we're not assuming that if fying is intentional, then fying is a good means to achieve the end for the sake of which it is occurring. But it may have some normative implications. I mean, occurring for the sake of something may have some normative implications. So fying may be a better or worse way of working one's way toward the goal in question. There are a few other issues in this section that I'm going to skip now, but we can come back to it in the Q&A, of course. Let's look at our first efficient causation-based account, which is the agent causal one. On this view, someone fies intentionally if the relevant movements of her body are caused by her as a mover. The metaphysical problem of agency and action seems then to boil down to the question about the nature and operation of such efficient causes, that is, an account of how agent as persisting substances can cause their own behavior. There are a number of problems with this view. The first is that omissions can also be intentional. For example, Socrates stayed intentionally in Athens, and it's not clear how this analysis can handle such cases. The second problem is that if we start treating substances as causes, then we end up with many other causal relations as well. For example, the hemlock poisoned Socrates, sugar sweetened my coffee, my alarm clock woke me up by causing that terrible noise, and so on. So the mere fact that a substance caused something doesn't make what it caused intentional. A closely related problem is the case of the neurologist tapping my knee with her reflex hammer. My moving of the leg manifests my power to move, but the movement was not intentional, even if I did raise my leg, and even if my leg's movement was a consequence of my moving it. One can object to this that this is only a reflex response, merely neural and muscular processes operate. But the question is precisely why bodily movements caused by the agent are merely such and such in certain cases, while manifest agency in others. So appealing to the mere fact that an agent as a substance can be a cause doesn't give us a royal road to analyzing intentional action. Something more is needed. Let's move on to the idea of rational control. Here, the suggestion is that someone fires intentionally if her firing is the causal consequence of her having or acquiring some reasons states like pro-attitudes, beliefs, or intentions. The challenge for this account is to identify those necessary and sufficient even causal antecedents that will guarantee that action is intentional. But even if you manage, and I take it from the paper that's a big challenge. But supposing that the challenge can be met, there are still two ways to interpret the significance of these reason states. Namely, that on the first view, behavior is intentional in virtue of having been brought about by these even causal antecedents, these pro-attitudes, beliefs, or intentions. And on a rival view, these antecedents merely guarantee that the agent is able to act for the sake of some end or for some reason. So there's an ambiguity in this view, even if we assume that it works. More specifically, there are problems with it as well. The first is that agents can act intentionally even when they do not have any reason for what they do, or when they act against their own reasons. And the second is that many agents can act intentionally even if they lack the capacity of rational control. So having reasons or mental states whose contents are reasons doesn't seem to be a precondition of intentional action. A third efficient causation-based view appeals to volitional control. On this view, someone fires intentionally if her firing is the result of some primeval form of control. For example, the result of volitions or acts of will. Whatever those might be, let's disregard the issue of whether we have a good grasp on what the volition is supposed to be. There's another initial problem that I'm not going to discuss, which is, and the paper doesn't either, which is Ryle's regressive volition. So if a volition is an action, then according to the view in question, you need a volition in order to perform a volition. So you need to, if you want to run, for example, then you have to will to run, and then you have to will to run, and so on into infinity. But let's bracket this problem. And let's focus on the following. It is obvious that not every causal consequence of a volition is an action. The act of willing to perform an action can result in many psychological, physiological, and behavioral changes, excitement, rising blood pressure, trembling hands, which are not intentional. We need to explain why only certain causal consequences of a volitional act or event are intentional. Now, one could suggest that those consequences are intentional that match the content of the volition. But if volitions are mental acts with content, then their content can only be intentional actions, and hence they can hardly explain the intentionality of behavior. So this view seems circular in a sense. Finally, we come to the idea that intentional action is connected to trying. So someone fires intentionally if she's trying to fire. Some authors talk about the ubiquity of trying. The idea is that whenever you say that someone did something intentionally, you can also claim that she was trying to do it, even though it may sound strange in certain contexts, because trying often implies that the action hasn't finished or wasn't successful, but still it seems to be permissible to talk about trying in every case when there is intentional action. Now, there are two problems about linking intentionality to trying. Let's take the famous example of David's moving his finger, flipping a light switch, turning on the light, illuminating the room, and alerting the burglar. If his trying to illuminate the room describes any action, then it seems it should describe something like his flipping the switch or his moving the finger. However, it sounds bizarre to say that he illuminated the room by trying to illuminate it. Hence, trying to illuminate the room cannot mean he's flipping the switch or moving his finger. So how can it express any action? The second problem concerns how we should understand the action of trying to do phi. So if trying is an action, then what is it really? If trying to move a finger is simply the act of willing to move it, then it seems that we have returned to the volitionist causalist interpretation of trying, which we initially wanted to reject. It's important to emphasize here, and this is a sort of segue into the teleological view, that there are two ways to understand the phrase or to use the phrase trying to phi. The first is to describe an action. One can use trying to phi to describe something that the agent has done, something that has been accomplished, but the result of which is distinct from the result of the action that the agent tried to perform. But alternatively, one could suggest that when we talk about tryings, we are not describing any action with any actual result, but we provide the content of trying to phi, irrespective of whether or not phiing actually occurs. And this second way seems to be the correct one according to Ho, and it seems to point towards the teleological understanding of action. And the similar distinction appears if we reflect on what it would mean to say that trying to phi has a content. On the first view, trying to phi is a mental state of the agent. But alternatively, one could suggest that trying to phi refers to an aspect or mode of the agent's behavior. And for example, trying to sit on the bed is not another action by which Socrates performs his sitting on his bed. Neither is it a strange way to describe what he does. And on the second view of trying, which seems to be the correct one, we're led to the teleological understanding of action. Trying to is the most general way on this view to identify an agent's ends at performing some actions with particular results for the sake of which she behaves in the way she does. It is for this reason, and it is in this sense, that trying is perhaps the mark of exercising agency, as it is manifested by intentional behavior. There were a couple of slides that I skipped. I think I'm going to stop here and allow Huo to correct any mistakes I made.
Thank you very much, Danny. I think you've done much better than I could have done. So I don't have anything correct, but I might add just a few things, which to explain partly what motivated things here. So one thing is that those who believe in the causal origin accounts of intentional behavior, or the intentionality of behavior, because that's what the issue here. I think very few of them, there are exceptions, but very few of them are concerned with the fact that animals can act intentionally. And that was, that's one of the reasons why I think that no matter how important for us that we have a mental life, and we of course want to understand how our mental life is related to our behavior, that cannot be the way to understand what makes it the behavior intentional, because the notion of intentional action is much more basic than anything like mental attribution. And of course, there are techniques to avoid this. You can quasi-beliefs and quasi-desires and things like that, but I don't think that this is actually explains much. And I think that these accounts are always motivated by the presupposition that no teleological account has any chance to give an account of intentional action. So that's why you are forced to say, introduce bizarre entities to explain the intentionality and ants or a bee's behavior. Even if dogs and horses might have mental states, that's a difficult issue. Some mental states they certainly have, whether they have such complexity which is similar to the way we can exercise intentional control over our voluntary control over our behavior. This is another issue, but it is just over. I think it's far too much to say that ants and beings, who can obviously behave intentionally, are such that we should ascribe any sort of mental states to them. So that's one thing I wanted to add. The other thing I wanted to add about the summary of what I say about teleology, there is a kind of side issue here, which is nonetheless somewhat important for me, that I think it's very intuitive to say that when we contrast intentional and non-intentional behavior in certain contexts, the distinction between intentional and non-intentional very nicely correspond to what we would say about accidental and non-accidental. So we would say that some form of he didn't do it accidentally. I think it's in many, I'm not saying it's always true, but in many contexts, it's obviously true that we mean that he did it with a certain intention, i.e. for the sake of the aims which the person actually had in acting. So, and I think this is very important because accidentality plays important role in lots of context. In philosophy, from philosophy of science to moral philosophy, philosophy of action, everything else. And there are attempts to understand non-accidentality, and some people do say that it wasn't an accident because it had a causes. And I think Aristotle had very good cases to show that in order to point to certain causes, the causal origin of certain event, not sufficient to explain why it was a non-accidental. So it could be events can have a perfectly intelligible causal origin, and nonetheless, we could say that those are accidental, or at least accidental under some description. But that's the important thing, the description under which they are accidental or coincidental. I mean, these are further issues. We don't have to get into this. So that's what I would add to that. Now I would add something to the rationality business. So, which was not as clear as the paper as it should be anyway. Almost every point of the paper requires further development. So that's happy to have comments and suggestions or objections, whatever. So, so why do I think that even if someone, you probably know the general issue. The general issue is that everyone admits, all causalists admit, that there are many situations which an agent has certain belief, desires, intentions. Those beliefs, desires, intentions cause something which the agent does. Nonetheless, the behavior was not intentional. So ascription of the type of mental states which these people think is relevant for explaining intentionality of behavior, plus adding the efficient causal claim, saying that these states are the efficient causes of behavior, cannot be sufficient. Now, I say that, and there are, endless attempts to add other things to explain that why then, what other conditions need to be satisfied in order the for the behavior to be intentional. So here I say that even if any of these had any chance to succeed, which I must say I can't really see, but even if that were the case, this wouldn't prove that what explains the intentionality is the occurrence of these conditions. Why not? And this is, you might say that, okay, this is just ideology. So those people have the ideology that you have to identify the causal origin. I have the ideology that you believe in teleology. You can't reduce teleology. So then what's your reason? Now, my reason is that what I'm really skeptical is not so much that you can add something in specific class of cases, which together with the mental states might be sufficient for producing the action. What I say that in different contexts, these going to be different. So the additional conditions will vary from one context to other. So you need a principle on the basis of which you select the extra conditions. Why these extra conditions work in situation 1 and why another one works in situation 2 when actually these don't works. I'm not going, if you want, I will tell you examples, but I don't want to spend time with this. So why this is so? And I say there is no other explanation. Then there is a teleological process. You already know there is a teleological process. And what you are looking for is, the causal conditions which you consider as sufficient means to realize this kind of teleological process, okay? And so there is a kind of stability in teleology and a variation of the additional conditions which are guided by the initial teleological assumptions. This is not in the paper, so I wanted to add. About the volition thing, maybe just a very little thing, because what Danny didn't mention. So why I think that the content of volition must be an action, because I think otherwise you would get all kinds of absurdity. So suppose I will that, so one important thing is that the content of volition only can be your own action. So I can will to raise my hand. I cannot will to raise Danny's hands, okay? Or if I can want it, or will it, if I can will it or have the volition or something like that, this is only that I can do it I can will it by doing something like grasping his hand and raising it. I cannot simply will to raise his hand. Also, I cannot simply will that tables hover over the ground, okay? So unless we already committed ourselves to an action, that there is something which is my action, an intentional form of behavior, there is no point of talking about willing. It would do all kinds of volitions with that content would be minimally paradoxical, or perhaps just bizarre and crazy. I think it's rather paradoxical, because if I do believe that I can make the just by willing to move the table, that would means that that's my action. So rather than saying that I just willed an event, I would say, okay, I can perform a bizarre intentional action by willing to move the table wheel just moves. So anyway, no matter which way you turn or twist or turn, I think that the very notion of volition already presupposes the intentional actions, which only possibly be their content.
We already have a question from Zita Todt. I am not disputing your conclusion, but one general worry here is that we really don't understand what final causes really are. According to a long tradition of Aristotelian philosophy, most of the later Middle Ages, final causes are explained as a form of intentionality. I'm not going to rehash the main arguments here, but basically it relies on the fact that for the sake of presupposes an intentional agent. But if this is the case, then you cannot explain intentionality by referring to final causes, since the explanation will be circular. In short, it seems you need a robust notion of final causes that is independent of intentionality, and it's not very clear that such can be given. Do you have any suggestions?
Thank you very much. This is a very important question. We actually, I think 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, when we discussed and never mind, Danny's paper, I already mentioned this with respect to occult qualities. So I don't think intentional. So as far as I know, I'm not an expert on the history of this, the notion of intentionality. But as far as I know, you are perfectly right that the notion of intentionality, as it is used in contemporary philosophy of action, derives from this medieval understanding of intentionality, where intentionality is indeed related to mental images, which are somehow can then ground the agent behavior. So intentionality is related to behavior as well, because just as an intentional behavior need not be completed in order to have an agent to have that intention. So, I can intend to write a paper, and that intention is there, even if I never finish writing it, or perhaps in some cases when I don't even try to do it. And this means that what people sometimes call the intentional objects of the states intentional states have an object such that its existence is not required for the thing to be in that state. Okay, and similarly with actions, a kind of action might be started and never finished. The object of the intentional action is not reached. So there seems to be a kind of connection between the notion of intentionality understood as a feature of certain kind of behavior and understood as a feature of certain states, typically mental states, never mind whether or not it is true that only the mental is intentional. So as far as the origin of this notion is concerned, unless I'm totally mistaken about this, I'm just relying on secondary sources here, so maybe I'm wrong about this. There is a connection between understanding the intentionality of behavior and the intentionality of the states. But for the first thing I would like to say to you as a response to your question, I think it's a big mistake to confuse the two, even if historically the notions have the same root. I think that the intentionality of action is a different issue than the intentionality of states. Never mind whether those are mental states. Some people actually in recent literature on dispositions argue that dispositional states are also intentional because they are directed at some events. Fragility is directed at breaking, etc. But let's suppose we're only talking about mentality. So when someone has a thought, then the thought has a content, and that's an intentional content that to which the thought is directed at. I think that this has nothing to do with teleology. So, okay, that's an overstatement. Of course, there is a connection when we want to understand how we actually control our own behavior. Okay, so then we must have make some connection between our representation of an action, okay, and then, for instance, our intentions typically represent certain actions, or at least they are related to they have an intentional content in this sense. They are the intentional content, the agent on action. So then there is a connection, but the two notions are different. I think there is intentionality without any action. So I can at least logically conceive something like a brain in butt, let's say, which has intentional states. So states which are mental, which are directed at something which have content, etc., etc. Never mind whether, I mean, Putman would deny this, but for just the argument's sake, suppose that this is conceivable, and no action whatsoever, at least no physical action. Okay, mental action, let's put on one hand, because I can come back to this if you want, but that's a different thing. So there is no action that, okay, but it's an intentional state. And I think, as I mentioned before, that it's crystal clear to me that there is intentional animal behavior when we have no good reason whatever to suppose that those animals who act actually have intentional mental states. I don't think so. I mean, at least this is again contentious. It's philosophy. Everything is contentious here. So there are some philosophers like Helen Stewart, for instance, says that any kind of animal is full of intentional states and mental representations, and they blah 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 blah. So, but at least allow me to say that this is a very brave hypothesis, and I would rather like to avoid it. So in my view, the intentionality of states, and specifically the intentionality of mental states, and the intentionality of behavior are two different things. And whether or not they are somehow connected, again, this is another issue. Perhaps they are in some way, but they are not the same thing. And what I would like to argue for is that in order to understand the intentionality of processes, and normally an action is a process, sometimes a very very short process, like raising a hand. Sometimes it's a very long process, like writing a paper, or I don't know, to live a life, if it's just one giant action of someone's part. So when it comes to an action, then the nature of this action is given by the teleological structure which it has. That the teleological structure is basically that someone is aiming in order to do something else. And of course, it can be much more complex. This is just the basic teleological structure. There are substructures and all kinds of other things, but that's the basic teleological structure. And I think that this aspect of the word, the teleological aspect, is not reducible to anything. And you don't need anything like mental representation to admit that there are such processes, and action, human action, is the most typical example of such kind of processes.
I'm going to go to a live question by Martin Pickup.
I'm sorry, I apologize I didn't get a chance to read the written version of the paper before the talk. So I've got a couple of probably quite minor questions. The first is about whether anything can be done for its own sake on the teleological model that you're describing. So suppose I sort of want to intentionally create a work of art, but what I'm doing it for the sake of, or my goal is just to create that work of art. Is that going to be a sufficiently kind of robust sense of intentional action? Can we slot in the very same thing as the intentional action, as being the very thing that we're doing it for the sake of? So that's one question. And the second question is, I was interested about the case of absences, which were used as a criticism of a different view. So the example, I think, was Socrates intending to stay in Athens. And it would just help me understand your positive proposal if you could explain how an example like that would be handled in the positive proposal that you were making towards the end of the paper. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I hope you don't mind if I start with the second question.
Sure.
Because that's something I go in some detail to explain in the original version. Not, great detail. Omissions are a big issue in philosophy of action, but I do say something about this. So I think that, so here are, so about Socrates. So here are the cases I have in mind. So the first is we have Socrates, and Socrates stays in Athens in order to comply with an obligation. So he considers that the only action and he thinks that the only action which would satisfy the aim to comply with Athens laws. I think that's one of, in the what is this? It's in the Phaedon, sorry. So in the Phaedon, where he says why he stays, his friends try to convince him to escape, etc., etc. And it's obvious that every reason which Socrates gives is a reason for, it's a reason which is formulated in terms of for the sake of. So I'm staying here, even if I will die, for the sake of fulfilling my obligation towards my political community or something like that. And that's an interesting case, I think, because here, because I want to say, and this is actually, it has further consequences to the view that the aims need not be specific events. It can be actions described in a larger context, like the aim of satisfying, doing something such that which satisfies the requirement of moral obligations or something like that. So that's about this. Another example I use, when you intentionally fly by taking an airplane to a certain destination, like, I don't know, you fly to London, let's say. And the idea is that when you are in the air, on the airplane, it's perfectly correct to say that, no, I'm intentionally doing something. I'm intentionally heading for London or intentionally flying there. And even if at that moment you have no control whatsoever, you are not supposed to, go to the, and I don't know, threaten the pilot to land somewhere else or something like that, So even I think it's perfect. So there are lots of actions which requires complex series of events. And there are segments of those events, actually even in very simple cases where you just raise your hand, which you cannot directly control. But nonetheless, it's perfectly okay to say that you are doing it intentionally because you are doing it for the sake of something, You're on the plane for the sake of getting to London, blah, 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 at this time, da, 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 da. So, and this is not merely omission. This is just a case when you are not even able to exercise at the moment any form of direct control what you are doing, and still it's perfectly fine to say that what you are doing, you're doing intentionally, you're doing as an agent. It's not a mere accident. It's not an unintentional, as you had been kidnapped or something like that. So I see a number of things about different cases where either you omit something or you don't have control what's happened to you seemingly at the moment, at that moment, and nonetheless, then it's perfectly fine to say that you're doing that intentionally. No causal connection between any of your mental states and the accomplishment of your ends at the moment, but you're doing it intentionally. Anyway, so I don't, there are further things to say. Now, for the own sake, for the things done for the own sake, here I must say that I can only say, I don't have my own thoughts, which doesn't mean that I don't have an answer, just the answer. I'm just saying what other people already said. And the idea here is that as long every action can be described in two ways. And especially, it's very easy in English. I mean, it would be much more difficult to express this in other things, as a process and as an accomplishment. The reason why it's easy to say in English, because you can describe something as what I'm actually doing or what I was doing when it was in a process in the past. And you can also describe it as things being done, okay, which already, so you have the progressive and you have the, which most languages don't have, I think, at least in this straightforward grammatical, form as you have it in English. So and there is something you've done. Now, the idea here is that there is no action, at least if we now concentrate on bodily actions. I think the mental things are always a bit complicated, so I would bracket now the mental action problem, okay? There is no intentional bodily action which would not involve some kind of process, even the shortest one. So there is no, so even if you mentioned artwork, perhaps. Now, doing an artwork, obviously, that's a process. There might not be, or it wasn't artwork, was it something else?
No, it was artwork. Yeah, that was the example.
So you might say that there is no further reason to do the artwork, and in fact, there must be a description of almost every action which is not done for further reasons. That's a big issue in ethics, whether, in fact, every action eventually must be done for the same thing. This is the big issue between Plato and Aristotle, whether the good can be said in many ways or just one way. But one can argue that eventually every action's final ultimate is a happiness or something like that. But that's a difficult issue in moral philosophy, and you don't have to be committed to any views like this in a philosophy of action. The only thing you have to be committed that even the simplest kind of action, like raising a hand, is such that it's a process which has parts, and the part of which are such that they are done for the sake of accomplishing the process. And the same is true about artwork. Maybe when I'm asking why are you making this artwork, you say no further aim. No, not for the sake of something else, not for the sake of becoming rich or famous or whatever. you know, it's something like philosophy. We don't do it for the sake of it. hard to find for the sake. So it's, but as long as it is a process, it is an action because it has parts of which you can say that is done for the sake of that goal. So that's what I would say about this. But thanks for the question. I have to include something about this. I didn't discuss it explicitly in the paper. And this is, of course, an important objection to any account which wants to understand intentionality in terms of teleology.
That was very helpful. I hadn't thought about it in those terms. I'm wondering, though, whether there might be maybe fewer cases, but some cases where we're doing something for its own sake, but not for the sake of having completed the action, but for the sake of being in the process of doing the action.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
And then it might be that...
no, absolutely, but I don't, okay, thank you. That's again very, so when I say for the sake of, that's a kind of relation, A for the sake of B, okay? So we can ask what should be, what kind of entity should be B, okay? Mm. And I would say, and this is again not original to me, that in most cases, B is another action. Mm. So we are doing A in order to do B. Now, and that's you know, I mean, I'm typing in order to write a paper. Okay, writing a paper is as action as typing. And that leads to other issues which I did not discuss in the paper, to which extent the teleological structure is represented by the so-called Aristotelian practical syllogism. Because the practical syllogism, the major premise, what you might say the aim, is an action. And the minor premise is a more specific action. And the syllogism says, the syllogism kind of rationalizes the behavior with reference to the fact that given that you want to do something, you have to do something else. Mm-hmm. So, and then something else is a process as well. So, of course, the end state, how actually the end as a state comes in the picture, is a further issue which I did not discuss in sufficient detail, but that's a further question.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Martin. We have a question from Elena. I was wondering if your considerations on accidentality and non-accidentality and the strength of a teleological approach in distinguishing them could be relevant to issues in the philosophy of social sciences in shedding light on concepts such as unintended consequences. What would be your thoughts on
that? I think yes. Very shortly, yes, I think yes. You know, Marx said once that they don't do, they don't know, but they are doing that, and that's a very paradoxical thing. If you think about, if you want to understand the actions in context of from the point of view of the first person, okay? Because in the first person case, which I'm also very much concerned in another paper, so that's the it's generally admitted that you can act intentionally if you know what you are doing. So you have a kind of special relationship to your own action. You have a special access, special knowledge. People say knowledge without observation. There is again big debate about how to understand this without evidence, etc., etc. But Marx says that you do this, and you don't know that you do it. So what does this mean? It means that any action can have unknown consequences. Okay, and the idea is that those unknown consequences are accidents. If you want to use this language, are accidents from the agent's point of view they are the agent action, but not the agent intentional action. Okay. So, and that mentioned, and of course, this is not just Marx. This is a different distinction you find in philosophy of action everywhere. That there are many descriptions of the same kind of behavior, and there's some like Oedipus and his mother and Jocasta. It's intentional. It was intentional under the description that he married Jocasta. It was not intentional under the description that he married his mother, even if that was what he did. So why I'm mentioning Marx, and in fact I would be more happy to mention Hegel, who is my new favorite, but that's it's always very complicated, this list of and all kind of stuff. So I just mentioned the simple Marxist claim. Now, why this is interesting? Because I think that this, if you try to use this kind of framework, so the standard way of understanding unintended consequences, that there are intentional actions which cause unintended consequences. But I think it may or may not be right, but I think it's a much more interesting approach to say that what agents do can be redescribed in very different contexts, sometimes as intentional and sometimes as, from their perspective, totally accidental, but even something which they did. So without manifesting their own agency, they contribute to the existence of certain social phenomena. Now, of course, this is at a very abstract level, and we should be more precise about this. But since you raised this question, and I never thought of that before, I must admit, but I think that I will think about this. Maybe that's another way to understand the collective effects of individual behavior, which are not which were not intended. I mean, the collective effect was not intended. So that the relationship more of a logical, social, conceptual kind than a causal kind. I'm not a great fan of causality anyway, so I try to. So that would be a kind of, okay.
Thank you, Elena. If you have any follow-ups, please let us know. Our next question is from Justin. Very interesting paper / talk. Thank you. I was wondering, how does this view respond to the idea that our true intentions are actually quite opaque or semi-unknowable to us? That what occurs in our mental theater is actually only a starting point for speculation on the actual mechanisms of nature, desire, volition, and action. In other words, in what way is trying and teleology related to intentional behavior when our experiences of our volitions are inaccurate with regard to the underlying drives or causes of such volitions?
Thank you, Justin. So this is actually a lot more difficult question than what I wanted to raise, because I was interested in the question, if a kind of behavior is intentional, then what explains its intentionality? You raised the question, if the agent has an intention, okay, which never mind whether the intention can be reduced or explained with reference to agent desires, beliefs, etc., or whether it's a genuine mental state. Those are further issues. So when an agent acts with an intention, how can we know what that intention was? Okay, so that's the what's the real intention? Whether in the case I mentioned was really was really to marry the mother or something like that. And perhaps he knew that she was Jocasta was her mother, just oppressed that thought or something like that. Or, you know, all kinds of difficult so-called psychological mechanisms can operate in all kinds of actions, and maybe it's not transparent to the agent what was intention. I think so. A few things I would like to say about this, though, as I said, it's a lot more complicated issue than what I try to answer. And the first thing is just related to what I did want to say. I don't really think that an agent can be mistaken about whether or not his action was intentional or her action was intentional. One can be mistaken about what the intention was, but whether or not it was entirely, you know, if there is no such third-person access, then I think we would lose absolute control over what we are doing, and that seemed to me nightmare. And it's not only nightmare. Factually, we can't make sense. We can't make the word intelligible if we think that we never know under any descriptions what we are doing. So under some descriptions, you know, like I don't know what marriage meant to the Greeks, but for instance, to go through the protocol, you know, and to know that this is the woman I marry or something like that. So there must be some description under which the agent knows what he or she does. Otherwise, this, I mean, I just don't know how we can have any contact with the world around us. Now, of course, there could be deeper intentions and further ends, and we would like to know what those things are, and maybe we are entirely wrong about that. One thing I would, and again, it's a big issue. For instance, it involves the concept of self-deception, which is one of the most difficult concepts in philosophical psychology. But one thing I would like to say perhaps is that it's a very complicated or very, how shall I put it, difficult or questionable or contentious issue. What we mean by psychological mechanism. And the reason why I'm saying this is the following. It's certainly not when we talk about psychological mechanism, we don't simply mean by certain brain states and, you know, brain events, if there are such things, or brain processes which somehow beyond the agent back just makes him or her to act, because then that's not an action. Okay, the action, I don't think that we would consider intentional action like that. So if we and what is very interesting, that when it comes to psychological mechanisms, and particularly in this kind of Freudian context, where you say that there are deeper motives, deeper desires, oppressed beliefs, and things like that which are harm, the only way you can actually have evidence that those things were there is analysis. I mean, now I'm not philosophical analysis, but psychological analysis. You have to squeeze it, as it's a metaphor. Maybe sorry if it's a bad metaphor, but that you have to somehow squeeze it out of the agent. He or she has to confess. Otherwise, you'd have no access whatsoever to this. Your theories about why people really do things, I think, maybe I'm very too conservative about this, but I think are mere empty hypotheses. It's really then when in a certain situation, you manage to identify the things by a kind of Socratic method, making the agent to confess that, okay, yes, this was it. Until that moment, it's mere hypothesis. So I think that even in the cases, and now we are talking about not the intentionality of action, but intentional control or voluntariness or self-understanding, so understanding ourselves why we doing certain things. So in all these cases, I think your only good method is to guide the agent to self-confession, to guide the agent to the point where he or she understand him or herself and realizes what the states and then report to you. So I'm very much believing in kind of first person access stuff, to be honest, and consciousness. But let me emphasize, this is a bit different than the question whether or not whatever the agent does or intends can be something which is not an intentional action of his own.
Thanks, that was helpful. We have a live question from Laszlo Bernat.
Thank you for your talk and your paper. Unfortunately, I could not read your paper, at least not all parts. So maybe my question will be a little bit ignorant. But so I had the impression that you criticize substantial, so substance causal theories of intention because it is hard to make a difference between, for example, when sugar cause something or an agent cause something or intentionally do something. But I think most theories of agent causal theories try to say something like that the substance has to cause the intention in a specific way. For example, somehow it has to rely on desires, beliefs, and stuff like that. For example, in O'Connor's view, the agent has to use somehow his or her desire when it produces an intention or something. So so I would like to ask you to make a bit more clear this problem for me, because I know that you know this all perfectly. Just somehow in the summary I didn't see that you confronted with this issue.
Thank you very much. Actually, I would like to say much more about this than I say in the paper. If I can reveal such things, I'm working on another paper, which is only about why agent causation is not a response to anything. So there are more to, even if you read the paper, that wouldn't have satisfied you, because there are many more to say. So maybe I do say 2 or 3 things without getting to a very, very long thing. So as you said correctly, my main concern is the following. We are obviously substances. If we are not substances, you know, there are people who deny this. If we are not substances as agents, so I'm not talking about Cartesian mental substance of anything. Maybe that also we are Cartesian mental substance, but minimally we are a physical thing with mental properties, and that's a substance. Yeah. And of course, many substances can cause things, and without doing anything intentionally. So my question is, how should you understand the difference here? Obviously, you need a concept of the agent which causes, which helps you to distinguish the forms of behavior which are, so the second step, but this is done very nicely summarized, is that given that we are such substances, we are substance cause a lot of things, you see? Okay. So if I walk on some thin ice, I substance cause that it will be broken, okay, and eventually end up in very freezy water. But that's not my intentional action at all. Okay, so suppose it's not. Okay, so you see what I mean. So that's so I can substance cause a lots of things, even more complex things than this, without doing anything intentionally. So the first point I would like to say that whatever explain the difference between the intentional and non-intentional behavior, it cannot be the mere fact that one is a special form of causation, which is not like a, so whom I had in mind here, especially is Chisholm, who says that age, and Reed as well, whom I liked once, written on him, that who claim that the specific form of agent causation, the specific form of causation, which occurs when you act intentionally, occurs only then. So only when you act intentionally, that's the only form of agent causation. And in all other cases, there isn't such a thing. No, I say that that's not true. I say that there are many contexts in which it's perfectly sensible to say that agents are causes. That's a longer story, of course, but that's, I argue for this, and not in this paper, but the one in progress.
Okay.
So therefore, the mere fact that this is a substance cause and not an event cause, it doesn't explain any difference. So you need to add something else. Now that already raises a problem, because then you would say that the substance or agent causations are not really explanatory in this context. I mean, they can be explanatory in the sense that the agent causes something, but it will not explain why what happened was an intention and why what not, because non-intentional things are caused as well by substances. Now, so if you add anything like desires, blah, 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 the first thing is, of course, that would immediately undermine my claim that creatures without a complex mental state can act intentionally, like bees or ants or anything. But if you add all these, then it seems to me that the explanatory load is no more about agency, but this extra distinguishing feature, the desire, the intention, and so on and so forth. Now, specifically about O'Connor, I'm not sure I understand very well his account of intentionality, but I think I understand relatively well his account of reason explanation, okay, where he makes reference to desires, intention, etc., etc. So how all these are produced and eventually ends with by an event causation process from the formation of intention to the actual physical behavior. So his account is a non-causalist account, and he's very explicit about this. So O'Connor's account is basically an elaboration of Ginnett's non-causalist account of agent causation. The one who has a very bizarre view is Clarke, because Clarke believes in a perfectly traditional, somewhat, I think, even primitive belief desire causal model of intentional action. And he just says that when the agent is free, then the agent causation jump up from nowhere, and then so that's I think now O'Connor's view I think is superior to Clarke's, but his account of the mental part of the whole story is totally non-causal.
Yes, it's true, but the production of the action seems to be causal. This is a bit weird.
Yes, but no one says that what explains the intentionality of an action is the causal process from a brain state to my movement.
No, not at all.
You know, because that would be ridiculous. I mean, all kinds of movement which I done, not just reflex movement, but any kind of movement induced in me, etc., would be in intentional action.
Yes.
So that part, the causal part, I think is totally irrelevant to the understanding of the intentional part. But it's all about, you know, it's all about freedom. And it's not that I'm not interested in freedom, as you know, but it's not about the very nature of intentionality, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. It was helpful.
Okay.
Thank you, Lotzi. We don't have any open questions now, so I will insert myself in the queue. So I'm trying to wrap my mind around what it would mean that something I'm doing has an intrinsic property of occurring for the sake of something. Do you think that this property supervenes on my other properties? Take the natural properties that characterize me, leave out the teleological ones. Do the teleological ones supervene on my natural properties? So is every qualitative duplicate of me having the same goals as I have?
Why do you think that they have to?
I'm not saying either way. I'm just
okay. No. I just try to understand. I try to understand what's the problem. So, suppose I want to say that the purpose of the heart is to provide the blood with oxygen. And not, for instance, I don't know, bumping rhythm or something like that. So why do you think that you need any kind of supervenience here? Because, you know, my view is, I mean, I know this is very contentious, so don't tell anyone that that's my view. But my view is that in this respect, there's a, if we are interested in the meteorological stuff, namely that what are the parts of the system do when such a thing is, such a process occurs, I would say that then my account of the teleological as well. So you can actually substitute the parts. It doesn't matter. So in this sense, I don't believe in, you know, there are two things. One is the mere logical supervenience, namely that if you have two kinds of mechanisms which do exactly the same context, then the same kind of teleology will occur. That's entirely fine. The context is important always. So teleology is a contextual thing, I believe. Most of the time, or maybe there are exceptions, but most of the time. But in the context, it is teleological. Okay, that's fine, but I don't think it explains anything at all. So you see, suppose that you're asking me why I wrote this paper, and I thought, and I would want to explain. Look, Danny, if I arrange the letters and spaces in the same order, in the same way, in another computer or in a or maybe handwritten or something like this, I would have got the same paper. I would be puzzled. Yes, it's true. So what? So I would think that the order of the things is there. So what you understand is why those orders are there and those letters are there, and not to mention even a more typical question of translation, where, you know, even the words are totally different, but the content is supposed to be the same if it's a good translation. Then I think this, of course, there is supervenience, but that doesn't explain anything. The things are there, arranged there, are there in order for underlying, as it were, for a teleological process. Now you might say that, okay, that's fine with intentional action, what about biology, etc., etc. But what I just would insist, and this is my new fixation, that the contemporaries metaphysics big mistake is the mereological one, that they think that the world could be made sense from the microscopic one, or the distribution of microscopic. No way. It's the other way around. You make sense of why the microscopic is behaving in the way, because there is a macroscopic world and macroscopic principles and things like that. Of course, this is another big project, so I'm not. But you see, so I accept, of course, this kind of trivial supervenience claim. I don't think that it itself explains anything. So because people think that because there is a logical dependence between the subvenient and the supervenient, namely that, this no difference without there, without here, blah, 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 that's sufficient to show that there is some kind of ontological priority there. And I don't think that this is right. And I started to argue for this. I have a short paper which actually concludes with, about the laws of nature, which concludes with considerations about this kind of issue, the primacy of macroscopic and thing. And
yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. So I only asked this question because I was wondering how naturalism friendly or unfriendly this view is.
It's not how shall I put it? I don't know. So it's not. So if we just want to say, if we characterize naturalism as, I don't know, David Lewis kinds of physicalism, that you have the distribution of the properties, microscopic properties in the world, and then everything else supervenes on that. Maybe I'm not sure how much I'm for or against it. But if it's meant to be that it is a kind of ontological, it expresses this fact, which I think is a logical fact. It's just logical fact that the big things, big things are different if the small things are different. So if it's more than that, so if it's want to say that really the fundamental structure of the world is fundamental because it's about the small, then I disagree with that. Now, whether or not this is naturalism or not, I don't know. I hope that if naturalism means to be continuous with the science, it's naturalist. If naturalism means contemporary ideology of physicalism, in the form in which it is usually formulated, this kind of supervenience thesis and things like that, then I'm not a naturalist. So I think I certainly wouldn't like to say anything which is incompatible with science. So if that's we have this minimal notion of naturalism, then I hope I'm not a naturalist. But if it's and again, it's got nothing to do with God and other issues.
We're near to the end. I still have a question, which is sort of a follow-up to the previous one. But if anyone else would like to add or ask anything, please do it now. Until people make up their mind. So we talked about teleology in animals and unconscious teleology. And this is all supposed to be in the spirit of Aristotle. So what about the crazier parts of Aristotle? Do you think that plants, the behavior of plants or the behavior of rocks can be, or in principle, teleological in your sense?
You can go further. You can ask whether the behavior of my kidney can be teleological. No, honestly, I'm not. So I think this is a question of where we draw the line of natural agency. And I must say that I don't at the moment have a good answer to that. I'm aware of this. This is an issue. So certainly I don't think I would find, I don't think that organs and plants, even plants, are intentional agents. But if you press me why exactly, and how you can explain it in my account, it's very difficult to answer. So in the case of humans and animals, I think it's relatively clear that the context in which we consider their behavior is related to their life forms, and that they have a life form that makes, you know, that's partly explained why they act and not just do things pseudo-teleologically or whatever, or not as an agent, certainly not as an agent. In the case of plants, it's more difficult because, in a sense, plants have a life form. You see, so I don't. So and here things got very how shall I put it? Hard to explain and hard to see clear reasons. So so if you actually ask me where I should, or where I could exactly draw the line between those things which I think agent in the sense of being capable of intentional actions, which I think ain't and bees belong to, but I don't think that the sunflower, for instance, belong to. I mean, of course, ever since Aristotle, we have decided that plants don't move. But, you know, I'm not good at biology, but I think that there are also animals which don't really move. You know, so it's not, and what about, you know, very simple animals, bacteria? What about bacteria, whether they are agents or not? I don't know. So where I don't have any criterion. I know that those cases when we can understand clearly that the organism has a life form, and then it's clear that his actions are done in order for things which is partly exercising this life form. It's clear that for me that they act intentionally. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about where to draw the line and what could I say about plants or parts of animals or things like that.
That's very interesting.
I have to think about this. This is a perfectly legitimate concern, and I do have that concern. But I don't have I rather not say anything silly. I don't have an answer to that now.
All right. We seem to have a Q&A question. Yeah, it's from Zita. Historical tidbit. Reference to natural teleology, teleology in case of rocks, plants, etc., gradually fell out of fashion in the Middle Ages precisely because of the stronger and stronger conviction that teleology presupposes intentionality. And I've been using intentionality in the contemporary sense, not in the medieval one. I'm aware of the equivocation and it's confusing.
All right. Thank you very much. So this is, again, I'm sorry for repeating myself. This is exactly what 2 weeks ago we talked a little bit. But if you don't mind, Danny, to end, I repeat what I said then. So I always wondered why 17th century philosophers talked about occult qualities. So why they said that explanation by being something poisonous or something has a kind of dispositional property is an occult quality. So why dispositions are occult qualities? And I read a very interesting explanation of this, according to which the idea was exactly what you mentioned here, is that these philosophers interpreted every kind of power, we would call dispositions today, they call it power, never mind, this kind of model properties, every kind of model property as intentional, not in the sense that they are simply, you know, something being poisonous is directed at poisoning or something like that, which is trivial, but in the sense that it can be so directed only if you assume that being poisonous is a mysterious mental property. Okay, which drives us intentionally through while poisoning someone. And that's why they thought that actually they maybe totally unfairly, but they refer to the late scholastic philosophers or scholasticism in general. You know, in 17th century, no one really referred to anyone else. It's just sort of the scholastics and things like, and the Aristotle and things like, and as if it was the same thing. Never mind. So, so the reason why they thought this is that they thought that all these dispositional properties are intentional because they are directed to something, and they thought that if it is such that they are directed to something, it must be such that you need to ascribe intentional states, mental state, quasi-mental states to the stones, to the I don't know, to the kind of substance which poisoning, etc., in order to in order to be able to ascribe the property. And so I think it's related to what you said, that if you, and I trust you that this is the case, actually then it turns out that the early moderns were very unfair, because it seems that the scholastic were aware of this objection and they tried to, you know, fence themselves off and saying that but even so, I mean, I think that to the extent the scholastic tied to the mental states issue, to the intentionality of the behavior issue, I would rather not do that.
Interesting. If I recall, Robert Pasnow has a chapter about these metaphysical themes. That's the name of his book. How the 17th century people understood or misunderstood the scholastics on God qualities. Great story, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I took it from somewhere else, but this is I can tell you where I got from if you're interested. It's a book on laws of nature, a history of laws of nature, and the origin of laws of the concept of laws of nature in the 17th century. I think it's called Walter Ort. That's how it's called, and sorry, that's how the author is called. And I can't recall the title, but anyways, the 17th century views on reactions to the scholastic philosophy of nature and how Descartes and others introduced the notion of laws of nature. I mean, that's a brand new thing historically, and historically considered that we understand nature as following laws. That's
all right. Thank you, Zita, and thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you for discussing this paper. Very helpful discussion.
All right, all the best to everyone. Thank you for being here, and stay safe.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.